Long before Absalom gathered an army, long before men across Israel began calling him king, and long before David was forced to leave Jerusalem with tears on his face, the rebellion had already begun in a place far more private than a battlefield. It began inside David's own house.
Absalom would become one of the most dangerous men David ever faced. He would win the affection of thousands, establish himself as a rival king, enter Jerusalem while his father fled, and come frighteningly close to taking the kingdom David had spent years building. And yet, Absalom was not a foreign conqueror. He was David's son. That is what makes his story so tragic. The enemy who nearly destroyed David's throne had once belonged at David's table. The man whose forces would fight against the king's army had grown up inside the royal family. His rebellion would eventually divide Israel, but before Israel was divided, David's household had already fractured. To understand how Absalom nearly stole the kingdom, we have to begin before the conspiracy, before the chariots, before the speeches at the city gate. We have to begin with a royal family carrying wounds that power could not hide. David had reached heights that would have seemed impossible during his youth. He had once been the overlooked shepherd boy of Bethlehem. He had faced Goliath while seasoned warriors stood afraid. He had survived Saul's attempts to kill him, lived as a fugitive, gathered loyal followers, and eventually became king. After years of conflict, Jerusalem became his capital. The Ark of God was brought into the city. Israel's enemies were pushed back. David's name became great. From the outside, his kingdom appeared increasingly secure. But Scripture refuses to tell the story of David as though public success erased private failure. The same biblical account that records his courage also records his sins. The same history that celebrates his victories does not conceal the consequences that entered his family. After David's adultery with Bathsheba and the arranged death of her husband Uriah, the prophet Nathan confronted him. David confessed his sin, and Nathan announced that the Lord had put away his sin. But forgiveness did not mean that every earthly consequence disappeared. Nathan warned that violence would arise from within David's own house. That warning would hang over the chapters that followed. This does not mean that every later person became a puppet without responsibility. Amnon would be responsible for Amnon's choices. Absalom would be responsible for Absalom's choices. David would be responsible for his own failures. But the biblical narrative deliberately places these family disasters in the shadow of what had already happened. David had defeated armies outside his borders. Now the most destructive battles would come from inside his family. Among David's sons was Absalom. His mother was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. That gave Absalom royal ancestry on both sides. His father ruled Israel. His maternal grandfather ruled Geshur, a small Aramean kingdom northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Absalom was therefore not an obscure child growing up at the edge of the royal household. He was a prince. And Scripture later gives him a physical description more striking than almost any other man in David's story. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, the text says, there was no blemish in him. His hair became famous enough for its weight to be mentioned when it was cut. In a culture where kingship was visible and public, where royal appearance could carry symbolic power, Absalom was the kind of prince people noticed. But physical beauty is not character, and the tragedy of Absalom is that outward magnificence would eventually exist beside inward resentment, calculation, ambition, and rebellion. None of that, however, should cause us to rush past what happened first. Before Absalom became the son who betrayed David, he was the brother of Tamar. Tamar was Absalom's sister. The biblical narrative describes her as beautiful. She was also the daughter of David, and another of David's sons, Amnon, became obsessed with her. Amnon was David's firstborn son. That fact mattered. In an ancient royal household, the king's eldest son naturally occupied an important position in questions of succession, even though the biblical story of David's dynasty would prove far more complicated than a simple firstborn inheritance. Amnon had status. Absalom had status. Tamar belonged to the same royal family, but royal walls offered no protection from what was about to happen. 2 Samuel tells us that Amnon became so consumed by desire for Tamar that he made himself ill. The text does not present this as honorable love. It quickly becomes clear that his desire is self-centered and destructive. Amnon wanted Tamar, but because she was a virgin living under the protections and expectations of the royal household, he believed he could not easily approach her. Then another figure entered the story. Jonadab, Amnon's cousin and friend, is described as a very shrewd man. He noticed Amnon's condition and asked why a king's son looked so miserable day after day. Amnon revealed his desire for Tamar. Instead of warning him, Jonadab gave him a plan. Amnon should pretend to be sick. When David came to see him, Amnon should ask that Tamar be sent to prepare food in his sight and feed him. The plan depended on trust. David trusted his son. Tamar would obey the king's request, and Amnon would use the privacy created by that trust for his own purposes. David came to Amnon. Amnon made the request, and David sent word to Tamar. Nothing in the text suggests that Tamar understood she was walking into a trap. She went to her brother's house and prepared food for him. Imagine the setting only as far as the text allows us to. This was not a dark alley outside the protection of the kingdom. This was the household of a royal son. Tamar had been sent there by her father. The danger was not supposed to be inside. When she brought the food, Amnon refused to eat. Then he ordered everyone else to leave. The room emptied. Amnon told Tamar to bring the food into the inner chamber so he could eat from her hand. She did. And then the situation changed. Amnon seized her. His request revealed what he actually wanted. Tamar resisted him. Her words are important because the biblical account does not portray her as silent or consenting. She appealed to morality, to Israel's standards, to the shame that would fall upon her, and even to the consequences for Amnon himself. She pleaded with him not to commit such an outrage. She tried to reason with him. She tried to stop him, but Amnon was stronger, and he violated her. Scripture does not linger on the physical details, and neither should we. The horror of the event does not need embellishment. The violation itself was devastating enough. But what happened immediately afterward exposed the emptiness of what Amnon had called desire. The text says that Amnon's hatred for Tamar became greater than the desire he had previously felt. In a moment, the woman he had claimed to want became the person he wanted removed from his sight. He ordered her to leave. Tamar understood that even this was another wrong. To cast her away after what he had done would deepen the damage and public shame. But Amnon refused to listen. He called a servant and ordered Tamar put outside. The door was locked behind her. A princess entered that house under her father's instruction. She left it devastated. Tamar was wearing the kind of special garment associated with the virgin daughters of the king. After she was thrown out, she put ashes on her head, tore her robe, placed her hand on her head, and went away crying aloud. The biblical writer does not hide her grief. And this is where Absalom enters the center of the tragedy. When he saw his sister, he understood enough to ask whether Amnon had been with her. Absalom then took Tamar into his own household. The text describes her afterward as a desolate woman living in the house of her brother Absalom. That detail should not be rushed past. Before Absalom became known for his political ambition, The narrative places him beside a sister whose life had been shattered by another son of David. The king heard what had happened. David became very angry, but the story records no immediate judicial action against Amnon. That absence becomes one of the most important tensions in everything that follows. We should be careful here. The biblical text tells us David was furious. It does not give us a long explanation of his private reasoning. We are not told exactly what arguments passed through his mind, what political concerns he weighed, or what conversations may have occurred outside the narrative. What we do know is what the story shows us. Amnon remained alive. Amnon remained within the royal world, and Absalom watched. He did not openly confront Amnon. 2 Samuel says Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, but the same verse tells us why. Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated Tamar. The silence then was not peace. It was hatred held beneath the surface. That distinction matters. A family can become quiet without becoming healed. A palace can appear stable while resentment grows behind its walls. And the king can control a nation while losing control of the conflicts inside his own house. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Nothing visible happened between the brothers. Absalom did not draw a sword in the palace. He did not publicly demand the throne. He did not announce rebellion. He waited. And that waiting would become one of the defining patterns of his story. Absalom was capable of patience when patience served his purpose. Later, when he wanted the kingdom, he would spend years cultivating public support. Here, when he wanted vengeance, he would also wait. Nearly 2 years would pass. 2 years in which Tamar remained in Absalom's house. 2 years in which Amnon continued living. 2 years in which David remained king. 2 years in which the royal household may have appeared from the outside to have moved beyond the scandal. But unresolved evil does not disappear merely because time passes. Sometimes time heals. Sometimes time hardens. And in Absalom, something was hardening. The story that would eventually send David fleeing barefoot from Jerusalem did not begin with a political manifesto. It began with a sister humiliated a brother, filled with hatred, another brother left unpunished, and a father whose anger had not restored what had been broken. Absalom had not yet tried to steal David's kingdom. He had not yet stood beside the gate, telling Israelites that their complaints deserved a better judge. He had not yet gathered chariots or sent secret messengers through the tribes. He had not yet declared himself king. But the first fracture was already there, and soon Absalom would create an opportunity. At Baal Hazor, near Ephraim, his sheep shearers would gather. There would be a celebration. The king's sons would be invited, and Absalom would make a special request concerning Amnon. After almost 2 years of silence, David's sons were about to sit together again. One of them believed the family crisis was in the past. Another had been waiting for exactly this moment. And the question hanging over David's house was no longer whether Absalom hated Amnon. It was what Absalom intended to do about it. For nearly 2 years, Absalom had said nothing to Amnon, no public accusation, no visible challenge, no attempt at immediate revenge. But silence was not forgiveness. Absalom had been waiting. Then came the season of sheep shearing. In the ancient world, sheep shearing could become a festive occasion. After months of labor, the gathering of wool was associated with food celebration, servants, workers, and invited guests. Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Baal Hazor, near Ephraim, and he decided to turn the occasion into something larger. He invited the king. Absalom approached David and asked him and his servants to attend the celebration. David declined. He did not want the entire royal household to become a burden upon his son. Absalom pressed him, but David still refused. Then Absalom made the request that mattered. If David would not come,
then perhaps Amnon could attend. The king hesitated. Why should he go with you? It was a reasonable question. The biblical text does not tell us whether David suspected danger. It does not explain whether he remembered the hostility that had followed Tamar's violation. We are simply told that Absalom continued urging him. Eventually, David agreed. And not only Amnon, but all the king's sons were allowed to go. The stage was set. For Amnon, it may have looked like a royal family gathering after years of silence. For Absalom, it was the moment he had prepared for. He gave his servants specific instructions. They were to watch Amnon. When Amnon had been drinking and Absalom gave the signal, they were to strike him down. The servants apparently understood the seriousness of what was being asked. Killing the king's firstborn son was not a small act of household revenge. It could mean death for everyone involved. So Absalom strengthened their resolve. He told them not to be afraid. He had commanded it. The responsibility was his. This was not an impulsive blow delivered in sudden rage. That point matters. Nearly 2 years had passed since Tamar's violation. Absalom had time to think. He had time to reconsider. He had time to seek another path. Instead, he planned. He chose the setting. He invited the guests. He prepared his servants, and he waited for Amnon to be vulnerable. At the feast, the moment came. Amnon had been drinking. Absalom gave the command. His servants struck Amnon and killed him. The long silence ended in blood. Then panic swept through the gathering. The other sons of David rose, mounted their mules, and fled. The royal celebration had become a crime scene. One prince was dead. Another had ordered his death. And the remaining princes raced back toward Jerusalem, uncertain of what might happen next. Before they reached the city, a report arrived at David's court. And the report was even worse than the truth. David was told that Absalom had killed all the king's sons. Not one remained alive. In an instant, David believed he had lost every son who had gone to Baal-Hazor. The king tore his clothes and fell to the ground. His servants stood around him with their garments torn. The palace that had already been wounded by Tamar's suffering was now overwhelmed by the possibility of a massacre. Then Jonadab spoke. The same Jonadab who had earlier helped Amnon create the scheme that trapped Tamar now appeared again. He told David that not all the king's sons had been killed. Only Amnon was dead. And then Jonadab revealed something chilling. He said that this had been Absalom's intention from the day Amnon violated Tamar. Whether Jonadab knew every detail of Absalom's plan beforehand is not stated. But he understood the motive. The murder was not random. It was revenge delayed. Soon the watchman looked into the distance and saw men approaching. The king's sons were returning. Jonadab pointed to them. Then David's sons entered the palace, raised their voices, and wept. David wept. His servants wept. The household mourned. Amnon was dead. But the grief of this moment had more than one layer. A father had lost his firstborn son. A brother had become a murderer. A daughter had already been devastated. And the royal family was being torn apart by consequences no army could fight. It is tempting to look at Absalom's killing of Amnon and reduce the scene to a simple act of justice. Amnon had committed a terrible wrong against Tamar. David's response had failed to produce visible justice. Absalom loved his sister and hated what Amnon had done. Those things help explain the anger behind the killing. But explanation is not the same as justification. The biblical narrative does not present Absalom as a lawful judge carrying out a sentence. He arranged an ambush. He used a feast. He involved servants, and he took his brother's life according to a plan he had held for years. The injustice against Tamar had not been properly resolved. Now Absalom answered one wrong with another act that would fracture the family further. This pattern is essential to understanding his later rebellion. Absalom repeatedly responds to broken relationships by taking control into his own hands. When he believes Amnon has escaped justice, Absalom creates his own justice. Later, when he believes the people lack proper access to judgment, he will position himself as the man who should judge them. And eventually, when David remains king, Absalom will act as though the kingdom itself should belong to someone else. The scale changes. The pattern does not. After Amnon's death, Absalom knew he could not remain near David, so he fled. But he did not flee to an unknown wilderness. He went to Geshur. This was significant because Geshur was the homeland of his mother. Absalom's mother Maacah was the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fugitive prince therefore had somewhere to go. He left his father's kingdom and went to the kingdom of his maternal grandfather. The son of Israel's king became an exile, and David remained in Jerusalem. Absalom would stay in Geshur for 3 years. 3 years is a long time in the life of a royal family, long enough for immediate outrage to become memory, long enough for political calculations to change, long enough for grief to shift, long enough for relationships to become even more complicated. The biblical text describes David mourning Amnon. Amnon had committed evil, but he was still David's son, and David grieved his death. That grief presents one of the recurring tensions in the story of David's family. The people closest to David can commit terrible wrongs, yet his identity as a father repeatedly complicates his response as king. With Amnon dead and Absalom gone, 2 major sons of David had effectively disappeared from his immediate household in a single event. One through death, one through exile, and still Tamar remained. The woman whose suffering had set this chain of events in motion does not receive a miraculous restoration in the narrative. She remains a reminder that the conflict was never merely about 2 ambitious princes. At the center of the first catastrophe stood someone who had been wronged and whose suffering had not been adequately answered. That is one reason this story should not be told as though Absalom simply woke one morning hungry for a crown. The road to rebellion was darker and more complicated. But neither should Absalom's later ambition be excused merely because his story began with legitimate anger. Pain can explain a direction without making every later choice righteous. A wound can become a reason for seeking justice. It can also become fuel for something else. During his 3 years in Geshur, Scripture tells us very little about Absalom's daily life. We should resist filling those years with invented conversations or imagined plots. We do not know whether he discussed the throne. We do not know whether he already envisioned himself as king. We do not know precisely how his thinking changed during exile. What the text does show is that the distance between father and son did not end the story. David's feelings began to shift. 2 Samuel describes a change in the king after he had been comforted concerning Amnon. The exact sense of the Hebrew expression in this passage has been discussed in different translations and interpretations, but the narrative soon makes one fact clear. The unresolved situation involving Absalom had become a matter the royal court could no longer ignore. And one man understood David well enough to act. Joab. Joab was more than another servant in David's palace. He was David's military commander and his nephew, the son of David's sister, Zeruiah. He had fought beside David. He had commanded armies. He had helped secure the kingdom. He had also proven capable of making decisions that David himself did not command. Joab could be loyal, ruthless, practical, and politically perceptive. And in Absalom's story, he would become one of the most important figures of all. He would help bring Absalom home. Years later, he would be the man who refused David's command to preserve Absalom's life. That makes his appearance at this point deeply ironic. The man who would eventually kill Absalom would first become one of the key reasons Absalom returned to Jerusalem. Joab recognized that something remained unresolved between David and his exiled son. But he did not simply walk into the throne room and demand that David restore Absalom. Instead, he created a strategy. He turned to a woman from Tekoa. Scripture calls her a wise woman. Joab gave her instructions. She was to dress as a mourner. She was to appear as someone who had been grieving for a long time. Then she would present David with a story. Her story concerned a family conflict. She would say that she was a widow with 2 sons. The sons had fought in the field. Because no one was there to separate them, one killed the other. Now the rest of the family demanded that she hand over the surviving son so that he could be put to death for his brother's blood. But if that happened, her last surviving heir would be destroyed. Her family line would disappear. The story was carefully designed. It placed David in the position of judge. It appealed to his compassion. And most importantly, it created a mirror. David would be asked to think about a grieving parent, a dead son, and another son whose life was threatened because of what he had done. The parallels to Absalom were difficult to miss once the trap closed. The woman came before David and fell on her face. She asked the king for help. David listened. As she unfolded the story, he promised protection. When she pressed the matter further, David gave stronger assurances. Then she turned the argument toward the king himself. Why, she asked, in effect, would David make such a judgment for her family while leaving his own banished son outside the kingdom? The story was no longer about an unnamed widow. It was about David. The king recognized that something more was happening. He asked the woman directly whether Joab had arranged the entire matter. She admitted that he had. Joab's hand was behind the story. David now understood the strategy. But he did not punish Joab for it. Instead, he made the decision Joab had wanted. Absalom could return. After 3 years in Geshur, the exiled prince was finally being called back to Jerusalem. It should have been the moment the family began healing. But David added a condition. Absalom could return to his own house. He could live again in Jerusalem. But he was not permitted to see the king's face. The distance between father and son would now shrink geographically, while remaining emotionally and politically unresolved. Absalom would be back in David's capital, back among the people, back near the palace, back in the city where royal power was concentrated, but not fully restored, not truly reconciled, not yet welcomed into David's presence. The exile was ending, the separation was not. And that unfinished reconciliation would create the next dangerous stage of Absalom's story. Because the prince who had spent years outside Jerusalem was about to return to the heart of the kingdom. And once there, Absalom would discover that being physically close to the throne was very different from being accepted by the man who sat upon it. Absalom was back in Jerusalem, but he was not back with David. That difference would shape everything that followed. For 3 years, Absalom had lived in Geshur beyond his father's kingdom. Now Joab's intervention had brought him home, but David refused to receive him. The king's command was clear. Absalom could return to his own house, but he could not see the king's face. So the prince lived in the same city as his father while remaining separated from him. Jerusalem was no ordinary city. It was David's capital. It was the political center of Israel. It was where the royal court gathered, where officials came and went, where military leaders received orders, where disputes reached the king, and where the future of the dynasty was constantly being shaped. Absalom was no longer far away in Geshur. He was now surrounded again by the world of royal power, yet the person at the center of that power would not see him. The biblical account says this condition continued for 2 full years. 2 years.
That means Absalom had first spent approximately 3 years in Geshur and then another 2 years in Jerusalem without appearing before David. Nearly 5 years had passed since the killing of Amnon. Time had moved forward, but the relationship between father and son remained unresolved. This is one of the most important features of the entire story. David allowed Absalom to return without fully restoring him. There was proximity without reconciliation. There was mercy without an obvious resolution of accountability. There was a return to Jerusalem, but no clear restoration of trust. And into that unresolved space, Absalom's public identity began to matter more and more. 2 Samuel pauses the political story to describe his appearance. The writer says that in all Israel there was no man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, the text says there was no blemish in him. His hair was particularly notable. When it became heavy, he would cut it, and the biblical account even records its weight according to the royal standard. Why include this detail? Scripture does not explicitly tell us that Absalom's beauty caused his rebellion, or that his hair made him politically successful. We should not invent that connection. But the description clearly establishes something about his public presence. Absalom was memorable. He looked like a prince. He possessed the kind of appearance that could reinforce royal expectations. In a kingdom where kings and princes were highly visible symbols of power that mattered, Israel had seen this before. Saul, the first king, had been physically impressive. He stood taller than the people around him. His appearance had helped create an immediate image of kingship. Now, Absalom, son of David, possessed his own striking public image. But the biblical story repeatedly warns against confusing appearance with character. A person may look suited for power while being completely unprepared to use power faithfully. And a man may attract admiration long before anyone understands what that admiration is being used to build. At this point, however, Absalom had a more immediate problem. He wanted access to David, and once again, Joab was the obvious person to approach. After all, Joab had been responsible for bringing him back from Geshur, so Absalom sent for him. Joab did not come. Absalom sent for him a second time. Again, Joab refused. The text does not tell us exactly why. Perhaps Joab believed he had already done enough. Perhaps he did not want to pressure David further. Perhaps the relationship between Joab and Absalom had changed. Whatever the reason, Absalom was being ignored. And Absalom did not respond well to being ignored. Near Absalom's property was a field belonging to Joab. Barley was growing there. Absalom turned to his servants and gave them a simple command: set it on fire. The servants obeyed. Joab's field burned. This act tells us something important about Absalom. When ordinary access failed, he forced a response. It was bold, it was destructive, and it worked. Joab came directly to Absalom's house. He demanded to know why his servants had burned the field. Absalom answered with striking directness. He had called Joab because he wanted Joab to go to David. And then Absalom expressed the frustration that had apparently built during his years of incomplete restoration. Why had he been brought back from Geshur if he was not going to see the king? From Absalom's perspective, the situation made little sense. If David intended to keep him permanently outside his presence, then exile might have been preferable. He had been returned to Jerusalem, yet he remained in a kind of political and relational limbo. Then Absalom made a dangerous statement. He told Joab to arrange for him to see the king. And if there was guilt in him, he said, then let the king put him to death. The words reveal just how intolerable the situation had become. Absalom wanted resolution, acceptance or judgment, restoration or punishment, but not endless distance. Joab took the message to David, and this time David agreed. Absalom came before the king. He entered David's presence and bowed with his face to the ground. For years he had been absent, first in Geshur, then in Jerusalem, but outside the king's presence. Now father and son finally stood together again. David kissed Absalom. It is a short sentence, but after everything that had happened, it carries enormous weight. The king received his son. The exile appeared to be over. The barrier appeared to be removed. A father who had lost Amnon now embraced the son responsible for Amnon's death. And Absalom was once again publicly connected to the king. At first glance, this might look like the ending the family needed. Absalom had returned. David had received him. The separation had ended. But the biblical narrative immediately moves towards something very different. Because whatever David's kiss meant emotionally, it did not end Absalom's story. It opened the next stage. The reconciliation scene contains almost no recorded conversation. There is no extended confession from Absalom, no detailed confrontation over Amnon, no description of Tamar being restored, no explanation of what David expected from Absalom afterward, no account of a repaired relationship built over time. The text simply tells us that Absalom bowed and David kissed him. We should not claim that nothing was ever discussed, simply because Scripture does not record it. But what Scripture chooses to show is significant. The narrative moves rapidly from Absalom's restoration into his construction of a political image. Something had changed. Absalom was no longer merely the brother who had avenged Tamar. He was no longer merely the son returning from exile. He was about to begin acting like a rival ruler. He acquired a chariot, he acquired horses, and he placed 50 men to run before him. These were not random luxuries. They created spectacle. When Absalom moved, people would see him coming. The 50 runners announced his presence before he arrived. The chariot separated him visually from ordinary citizens. The horses projected status. He was building the image of royal authority. This becomes even more striking when we remember that David was still king. Absalom had not inherited the throne. He had not been crowned. He had not been appointed co-regent. Scripture records no divine call establishing him as David's successor. Yet he began surrounding himself with the visible symbols of someone important enough to be treated like a ruler. Ambition often becomes visible before it becomes verbal. Before Absalom openly claimed kingship, he began presenting himself in a way that invited people to imagine it. Then he changed his routine. He began rising early, and he positioned himself beside the road leading to the city gate. To a modern reader, a city gate may sound like a simple entrance. But in the ancient world, the gate could be much more. It was a place of commerce, a place of public interaction, a place where elders could gather, and critically for Absalom's strategy, it was associated with legal matters and judgment. People with disputes came seeking decisions. People with grievances wanted someone in authority to hear them. Absalom understood the opportunity. He did not begin by marching into David's palace with soldiers. He began by meeting people before they reached David. Imagine the political power of that position. Every person arriving with a complaint already felt that something had gone wrong. They had a dispute, a conflict, a grievance, a case they believed deserved justice. And before they reached the king's system, they encountered the king's handsome son. Absalom would ask where they came from. The person would identify his tribe. Absalom would listen. Then he would say something that sounded deeply encouraging. Their claims were good and right. Their case deserved attention. But there was a problem. There was no one appointed by the king to hear them. This was an extraordinary political message. Absalom was not simply praising the people.
He was quietly criticizing David's administration. The implication was clear. Your problem is legitimate. You deserve justice, but the existing system is failing you. Then Absalom offered the solution. Himself. He would say, in effect, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone with a dispute could come to me, and I would give them justice." This was not yet an open declaration that David should lose the throne. It was more subtle. Absalom presented himself as the ruler people wished they had. He did not need to say David is a bad king. He only needed each disappointed person to feel Absalom understands me better. Absalom would hear me. Absalom would treat me fairly. Absalom should have authority. And then he added a personal gesture. When someone approached and bowed before him, Absalom would reach out, take hold of the person, and kiss him. That gesture narrowed the distance between prince and citizen. Instead of remaining elevated and unreachable, Absalom made people feel personally valued. The strategy was powerful because it combined spectacle with intimacy. From a distance, he looked royal. Up close, he appeared accessible. He had the chariot, the runners, the famous appearance, the status of David's son. But at the gate, he also created the feeling that ordinary people mattered to him. This is how political loyalty can change, not always through war, not first through commands. Often through repeated encounters. A grievance is heard, a weakness in government is highlighted, an alternative is presented, a personal bond is created, and the process repeats, day after day, case after case, tribe after tribe. The biblical writer eventually summarizes the result with one of the most important statements in Absalom's story. Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. The language is deliberate. He did not simply become popular. He took loyalty that belonged to the king and redirected it toward himself. The kingdom still had David on the throne, but in the hearts of growing numbers of Israelites, another possibility was being created, and Absalom was patient. The same man who had waited 2 years before striking Amnon now spent an extended period cultivating political support. The Hebrew text contains a chronological number at this point that has produced textual and interpretive discussion, with some traditions reading 40 years and some ancient witnesses supporting 4 years. Whatever precise chronological solution one adopts, the narrative's central point is clear. This was not a spontaneous uprising created in a single afternoon. Absalom worked overtime. He built relationships. He shaped perceptions. He allowed dissatisfaction to accumulate around his name, and David appears not to have stopped him. That silence is striking. David had once been extraordinarily alert to political danger. He had survived Saul. He had navigated rival claims to kingship. He had dealt with rebellions, foreign enemies, military commanders, tribal tensions, and court politics. Yet now, the threat was growing beside his own gate. Perhaps David underestimated his son. Perhaps Absalom's actions did not initially look like treason. Perhaps the king knew more than the narrative reveals. We cannot say. But the outcome is undeniable. Absalom was becoming a political alternative, and once enough loyalty had been gathered, he moved to the next stage. He approached David again. This time he had a religious explanation for leaving Jerusalem. Absalom said that while living in Geshur, he had made a vow. If the Lord brought him back to Jerusalem, he would worship the Lord. Now he told David he wanted permission to go to Hebron and fulfill that vow. The request sounded appropriate. Hebron was not a random location. It had deep significance in David's own history. David had once ruled from Hebron before becoming king over all Israel. It was where his kingship over Judah had begun. And now Absalom wanted to go there. David gave permission. Go in peace. Those words are among the most tragic ironies in this entire story. David believed he was sending his son to fulfill a vow. Absalom was preparing to announce a kingdom.
Secret messengers had been arranged throughout the tribes of Israel. At the sound of the trumpet, they were to spread the message. Absalom was king in Hebron. The man who had once been exiled from David's presence was now preparing to take David's place. He had been brought home through Joab. He had been received by his father. He had been kissed by the king. He had stood at the gate. He had listened to the people. He had cultivated their trust. And now the private fracture inside David's family was about to become a national rebellion. Absalom left Jerusalem with David's blessing. But peace was the one thing he was not carrying to Hebron. He was carrying a conspiracy. And when the trumpet sounded, David would discover just how many hearts his son had already taken. Absalom left Jerusalem with the king's permission. David had told him, "Go in peace." But Absalom was not going to Hebron merely to fulfill a vow. He was going there to turn years of carefully cultivated popularity into open rebellion. The plan was already in motion. Secret messengers had been sent throughout the tribes of Israel. They carried a simple instruction. When the sound of the trumpet was heard, they were to announce that Absalom had become king in Hebron. Hebron was a brilliant choice. This was not an obscure town at the edge of the kingdom. It was one of the most important cities in David's own rise to power. Before Jerusalem became his capital, David had ruled from Hebron. After Saul's death, the men of Judah had anointed David king there. Later, representatives of all Israel came to Hebron and acknowledged him as king over the united tribes. Hebron belonged to the story of David's legitimacy. Now Absalom was using the same city to create a rival claim. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The son was stepping into the geography of the father's rise. Absalom also took 200 men from Jerusalem with him. The biblical text emphasizes that they went innocently. They did not know the full purpose of the journey. This detail matters. Absalom's conspiracy was already larger than the circle of people who fully understood it. Some men were present because they had been invited, others were part of the plan. And as the movement grew, the appearance of support could help create even more support. Political momentum often works that way. People see respected men present. They hear that important leaders have joined. They assume the movement must be stronger than they realized. Then others begin to move toward it. But Absalom needed more than appearance. He needed men with real influence. And one name transformed the seriousness of his rebellion. Ahithophel. Ahithophel had been one of David's counselors. His reputation was extraordinary. Later in the narrative, the advice he gave in those days is described as though one were consulting the word of God. That does not mean Ahithophel was infallible or divinely inspired in everything he said. It means his political counsel was held in exceptionally high regard. A king surrounded by soldiers was powerful. A king surrounded by wise counselors was harder to defeat. David had both. And now one of those counselors crossed over to Absalom. Absalom sent for Ahithophel from Gilo while sacrifices were being offered. Ahithophel joined him. The conspiracy grew stronger, and more people continued to side with Absalom. This was the moment when what had once looked like the ambition of one prince became a genuine threat to the monarchy. Absalom had supporters among the people. He had royal status. He had a recognizable public image. He had spent years cultivating grievances. He had chosen a city rich with political meaning. Now he had one of David's most respected advisors. The rebellion was no longer theoretical. It had structure. It had communication. It had leadership. It had momentum. And somewhere between Hebron and Jerusalem, a messenger began moving toward David. The message he carried would change the king's world in a single sentence. The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. That was the crisis.
David did not need to be told merely that Absalom had declared himself king. A declaration could be ignored if no one followed it. What terrified the court was that Absalom had people. The very phrase used earlier to describe his work at the gate was now becoming a national reality. He had stolen hearts, and those hearts were becoming a political force. David had spent decades building the kingdom. He had fought Philistines. He had survived Saul. He had defeated rival powers. He had taken Jerusalem. He had gathered tribes around one throne. Now his own son had managed to turn a significant portion of that kingdom against him without first defeating him in battle. Absalom's most important victories had been won before the armies moved. He had won perception. He had won confidence. He had won dissatisfaction. And now he was trying to convert those invisible victories into a crown. When the news reached David, the king's response was immediate. He told his servants in Jerusalem that they had to leave. If they remained, he feared they would not escape Absalom. David understood speed. He understood military danger, and he understood his son well enough to know that hesitation could be fatal. "Arise and let us flee." Consider how extraordinary that command was. This was David, the man who had stood before Goliath, the warrior whose name had been sung across Israel, the king who had commanded armies and expanded the kingdom, the ruler who had made Jerusalem his city. And now he was preparing to abandon Jerusalem because his own son was coming. This was not necessarily cowardice. It was strategy. If David remained in the capital, Absalom could reach him quickly. Jerusalem might become the battlefield. Civilians could die. The city could be destroyed in a struggle between rival kings. David chose movement. He would give himself time. He would preserve his loyal followers. He would force Absalom to pursue rather than immediately capture the king. But military logic did not make the moment less humiliating. David was being driven out of his own capital, not by Philistines, not by Moabites, not by Ammonites, by Absalom. The fracture inside David's house had now reached the throne. The king's servants answered that they were ready to do whatever David commanded, so the royal household began to move. David left Jerusalem with those who remained loyal. The biblical narrative gives careful attention to the people who chose to leave with him. That is important because Absalom's rebellion was not merely a contest between two men. It became a test of loyalty across the entire kingdom. Some people abandoned David. Others stayed. Some calculated which side would win. Others attached themselves to David even when his position looked weak. One of the most striking examples was Ittai the Gittite. Ittai was associated with Gath, a Philistine city that had once represented enemy territory to Israel. He and his people had apparently only recently joined David. David looked at him and essentially told him there was no reason to share the king's uncertain fate. Why should Ittai wander with a fugitive ruler? He had only arrived recently. He could return. He could stay with the new king. David even blessed him and released him from any obligation, but Ittai refused. His answer became one of the strongest statements of loyalty in the entire episode. Wherever David was, whether it meant life or death, Ittai said he would remain with him. That contrast is striking. Absalom was David's own son, yet he was trying to take his throne. Ittai was a foreign-born follower, with no lifelong family claim, yet he chose to walk beside David when doing so was dangerous. Blood did not guarantee loyalty, and foreign origin did not prevent faithfulness. As David's people left, the atmosphere around Jerusalem changed. The text describes the land weeping with a loud voice. The people crossed the Kidron Valley. The king moved away from the city. This was more than a military withdrawal. It was a public reversal. David had once entered Jerusalem as the conquering king. Now he was leaving it under threat. The road east from Jerusalem eventually climbs toward the Mount of Olives. That route would become the path of David's humiliation. But before he reached it, another scene unfolded around the Ark of the Covenant. Zadok and the Levites brought the Ark with them. Abiathar was also there. To David's followers, the presence of the Ark might have seemed natural. If the king was leaving, perhaps the sacred symbol of God's covenant presence should leave with him. Perhaps carrying the Ark would strengthen morale. Perhaps it could communicate that God remained with David. But David refused to use the Ark as a political object. He told Zadok to carry it back into Jerusalem. His words revealed a remarkable posture. If he found favor with the Lord, David said, God could bring him back and allow him to see the Ark and its dwelling place again. But if God said he had no pleasure in him, David was prepared to accept what the Lord chose. This moment separates David sharply from the kind of kingship Absalom was constructing. Absalom had worked to control public perception. David, at least here, refused to treat the Ark as a tool for controlling the outcome. He would not pretend that possession of a sacred object guaranteed possession of the kingdom. Israel's history already contained a warning about that mistake. Generations earlier, during the days of Eli, Israel had carried the Ark into battle as though its presence could force victory. The result had been disaster. David would not repeat that logic. The Ark returned to Jerusalem. The king continued into exile. But David was also thinking strategically. Zadok and Abiathar could remain in the city. Their sons Ahimaaz and Jonathan could serve as messengers. Information would become one of David's greatest weapons. Absalom controlled Jerusalem, but David could still build eyes and ears inside the capital. The king, who was retreating, had not stopped planning. Then another piece of news reached David. Ahithophel was among the conspirators. This struck deeply. Losing ordinary supporters was dangerous. Losing Ahithophel was different. David knew exactly how valuable his counsel could be. So David prayed that Ahithophel's advice would be turned into foolishness. And almost immediately after this, another figure appeared. Hushai the Archite met David with his robe torn and dust on his head, signs of mourning. Hushai was loyal to David. He wanted to accompany him, but David saw another possibility. If Hushai joined the fleeing group, he could become a burden during rapid movement. But if he returned to Jerusalem and presented himself to Absalom as a servant, he might be able to undermine Ahithophel's counsel. This was dangerous. Absalom was not a naive child anymore. He was leading a rebellion. If Hushai's loyalty to David was discovered, the consequences could be deadly. Yet David sent him back. Now the counter-conspiracy was taking shape. Zadok and Abiathar would remain connected to David. Their sons could carry intelligence. Hushai would enter Absalom's court. The kingdom was dividing not only into armies, but into networks of information, loyalty, deception, and counsel. David had lost control of Jerusalem. But he had not lost every advantage. Then came one of the most painful images in David's life. As he climbed the Mount of Olives, David wept. His head was covered. He walked barefoot. The people with him covered their heads and wept as well. The great king looked like a mourner. The warrior looked defeated. The man who had once entered royal life through victory over Goliath now climbed away from his throne with tears. And the cause was his son. The geography itself adds weight to the scene. David could look back toward Jerusalem. The city remained standing. His palace remained there. The ark remained there. But David was leaving. A king can possess a palace and still lose a kingdom. A king can possess an army and still lose the people. And sometimes, by the time the visible collapse happens, the real loss has been occurring quietly for years. That was Absalom's greatest success. He had not begun by attacking Jerusalem. He had attacked David's legitimacy in the minds of the people. He had stood at the gate and suggested that justice was failing. He had placed himself between citizen and king. He had made himself accessible. He had made himself impressive. He had made himself desirable. Then when the moment came, thousands were ready to imagine him wearing the crown. That is what made this rebellion so dangerous. But David's humiliation was not finished. As he moved eastward, he encountered Ziba, the servant, connected to Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. Ziba brought supplies, donkeys, bread, fruit, and wine. In the confusion of David's flight, provisions mattered. Then David asked about Mephibosheth. Ziba claimed that Mephibosheth had remained in Jerusalem because he believed the crisis might somehow restore Saul's kingdom to him. David reacted quickly and granted Ziba what had belonged to Mephibosheth. Later, when David returned, Mephibosheth would give a very different account. That later conflict reminds us how difficult judgment becomes during political chaos. Information arrives quickly. Loyalty becomes uncertain. Men use crises to improve their own position. Kings make decisions under pressure, and truth can become harder to establish. Absalom's rebellion was destabilizing more than the throne. It was destabilizing relationships across the kingdom. Then David reached Bahurim. There he encountered a man whose hatred of him had been waiting for a moment of weakness. Shimei, from the family of Saul, came out cursing David. He threw stones toward David and his servants. He accused the king of bloodshed and claimed that the Lord had returned the kingdom's violence upon him. To Shimei, Absalom's rebellion was divine repayment. Whether his interpretation was correct is another matter. The biblical narrative does not authorize every word spoken by a character simply because it records the speech. But Shimei's actions reveal how vulnerable David had become. When David was secure in Jerusalem, men like Shimei could not stand near him throwing stones. Now the king was passing through the countryside under humiliation. Old enemies felt bold. Abishai, one of David's warriors, and Joab's brother, wanted permission to kill Shimei. David refused. Again, David showed a willingness to interpret his suffering under the possibility of divine discipline. He said that his own son was seeking his life. Why should he be surprised that a Benjamite cursed him? Perhaps David reasoned the Lord would see his suffering and repay good for the curse. So David continued. Shimei kept walking along the hillside, cursing, throwing stones, and flinging dust. The king's humiliation was now public. His son had taken his capital. His advisor had betrayed him. His enemies insulted him. His followers were exhausted, and the throne looked as though it might already belong to someone else. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem. Hushai approached him. "Long live the king!" It was exactly the kind of greeting Absalom wanted to hear. But Absalom immediately questioned him. Was this how Hushai showed loyalty to David? Why had he not gone with his friend? Hushai answered carefully. He said he would serve the one chosen by the Lord, by the people, and by the men of Israel. Then he added another argument. Why should he not serve the Son as he had served the Father? The words were ambiguous enough to conceal his true loyalty. Absalom accepted him. David's agent was now inside the rebel court. And then Absalom turned to Ahithophel. "What shall we do?" This was the moment the rebellion entered its most dangerous phase. Winning Jerusalem was not enough. David was still alive. As long as David lived, Absalom's kingship was insecure. People could return to him. Soldiers could gather around him. Tribes could reconsider. The old king still had experienced commanders, and David knew how to survive as a fugitive better than almost anyone in Israel. Absalom needed to make the break irreversible. Ahithophel gave counsel designed to accomplish exactly that. He advised Absalom to take possession of David's concubines, who had been left to care for the palace.
In the ancient royal context, publicly taking the women of a former king could communicate a claim over that king's household and authority. It would make the rupture between father and son unmistakable. There would be no easy reconciliation after such a public act. A tent was set up on the roof, and before the eyes of Israel, Absalom followed the counsel. The scene carried terrible echoes. It happened on a roof. Years earlier, David's sin with Bathsheba had begun when he saw her from the roof of his palace. Nathan had warned David that, although his sin had been committed secretly, calamity would arise within his own house and be exposed publicly. Now, in the rebellion of David's son, that warning had reached a horrifying fulfillment. This does not remove Absalom's responsibility. He chose his actions. But the biblical narrative wants the reader to see the connection. The consequences of sin can travel farther than the moment in which the sin was committed. David had been forgiven, yet his house was still living through the aftermath of destructive choices. And now Absalom had crossed another line. The rebellion was no longer merely political disagreement. The relationship with David had been publicly desecrated. Reconciliation had been made far more difficult, and Absalom believed his position was growing stronger. He was in Jerusalem. David was outside the city. The palace was his. The people had followed him. Ahithophel advised him. From every visible angle, Absalom appeared to be winning. But one problem remained. David was alive, and Ahithophel knew exactly what that meant. He was about to give Absalom another piece of advice. This time it would not be about symbolism. It would not be about public image. It would be a military plan, a fast strike, a carefully chosen force, an exhausted fugitive king. If Absalom accepted it immediately, the rebellion might end before David had time to recover. For all Absalom's years of planning the fate of the kingdom was now about to turn on a single question. Whose counsel would he trust? Jerusalem belonged to Absalom, at least for the moment. He had entered the capital without fighting a major battle. David had fled eastward. The palace stood open to the rebel prince. The people who had once looked toward David now watched Absalom take his place at the center of royal power. From the outside, the revolution appeared almost complete. But Ahithophel understood what Absalom could not afford to forget. A throne is not secure while the former king is still alive. David was exhausted. His household was moving quickly. His supporters were scattered. He had crossed out of Jerusalem under humiliation and grief. And although experienced warriors remained beside him, they had not yet had time to gather the full strength of those who would stay loyal. This was the moment to strike. Ahithophel asked Absalom for permission to choose 12,000 men. He proposed leaving that very night. No delay, no grand mobilization, no long preparation. He wanted speed. He would pursue David while the king was weary and discouraged. Then Ahithophel said he would create panic among David's people. The men around the king would flee, and Ahithophel would strike only David. After David was dead, the rest of the people could be brought back. One life in Ahithophel's calculation stood between Absalom and the kingdom. It was ruthless advice, but militarily it was dangerous precisely because it made sense. David was not merely a father escaping his rebellious son. He was the center of the resistance. Kill David quickly, and the rebellion might be over before his supporters could reorganize. Allow David time, and Absalom would face something very different. He would no longer be chasing a frightened household out of Jerusalem. He would be facing David, the military survivor, the man who had spent years escaping Saul, the commander who understood terrain, the leader around whom battle-tested men had gathered for decades. Ahithophel wanted to destroy the resistance before it could become an army. Absalom and the elders of Israel initially approved the plan. The biblical account says the advice seemed good to them.
If the story had ended there, David might have been in immediate danger. But Absalom did something else. He asked for Hushai, David's loyal friend, the man David had deliberately sent back into Jerusalem. The man whose entire purpose inside Absalom's court was to frustrate Ahithophel's counsel. Now Hushai was being given his opportunity. Absalom explained Ahithophel's proposal. Then he asked Hushai what he thought. Hushai knew he was standing in a dangerous room. He could not simply say that David needed more time. He could not reveal that his loyalty remained with the fleeing king. He had to make delay sound like wisdom, and he had to make Ahithophel's good advice sound dangerously inadequate. So Hushai began with something unexpected. This time he said Ahithophel's counsel was not good. Then he appealed to what everyone in that room already knew about David. David and his men were warriors, experienced warriors, men hardened by battle. And right now, Hushai argued they would be enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs. David was also experienced in warfare. He might not even be staying with the people. Perhaps he had hidden himself in a cave or another secure location. If Absalom's first attack failed and some of his men were killed, word could spread that Absalom's forces had suffered defeat. Fear could reverse the psychological momentum of the rebellion. Even courageous men could lose confidence. Hushai understood that Absalom had built his movement partly upon appearances. Momentum mattered. The perception of inevitable victory mattered. A failed first strike could damage both. Then Hushai offered an alternative, and his alternative was designed to appeal directly to Absalom's sense of greatness. Do not send Ahithophel with 12,000 men. Gather all Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Build an army so large that it appears like sand beside the sea, and then Absalom himself should lead it. That last point mattered. Ahithophel's plan placed Ahithophel at the head of the strike. Hushai's plan placed Absalom at the center of the spectacle. Absalom would not remain behind while someone else won his kingdom. He would lead the assembled nation. If David were found in a city, Hushai said, they would overwhelm it. If he were found in the open country, they would fall upon him like dew covering the ground. The language was grand, comprehensive, overwhelming. It made victory sound not merely likely, but majestic. And Absalom chose it. The men of Israel agreed. Hushai's counsel was judged better than Ahithophel's. From a purely human perspective, Absalom had just rejected the more immediately dangerous military strategy. But the biblical narrator does not leave the decision at the level of political psychology. 2 Samuel explicitly interprets the moment. The Lord had determined to frustrate the good counsel of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster upon Absalom. That theological statement is essential to the narrative. Hushai used intelligence. He understood Absalom. He framed his argument skillfully. But the biblical writer sees something larger behind the human strategy. Absalom had reached Jerusalem. He had gathered support. He had publicly humiliated David. Yet his success did not place the outcome beyond God's sovereignty. A rebellion can appear unstoppable and still turn on one decision, and Absalom had just made that decision. Hushai could not celebrate. David was still vulnerable. Ahithophel's plan had been rejected, but Absalom was now gathering a much larger army. Hushai needed to get word to the king. He went to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests David had left in Jerusalem. He explained both plans. Ahithophel had advised an immediate pursuit. Hushai had successfully argued for delay. But David could not assume the danger was over. The message was urgent. Do not spend the night at the wilderness crossings. Cross the Jordan. Move farther away. If Absalom changed his mind or if some rapid force was sent out, David needed the river between himself and Jerusalem. The priests passed the message through their sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz. These young men could not simply walk openly between David's camp and the rebel-controlled capital. They waited near Enrogel, outside Jerusalem. A female servant carried information to them. Then they would carry it onward to David. It was a quiet intelligence network operating behind the rebellion. But secrecy is fragile. A young man saw them. Word reached Absalom. Jonathan and Ahimaaz immediately fled. They reached Bahurim and entered the house of a man who had a well in his courtyard. They climbed down into it. Then a woman spread a covering over the mouth of the well and scattered grain on top. To anyone looking quickly, the place appeared ordinary. Absalom's servants arrived. They asked where Ahimaaz and Jonathan had gone. The woman misdirected them. The pursuers searched and found nothing. Eventually they returned to Jerusalem. Only then did the messengers climb out of the well.
The whole episode reveals how close David's network came to collapsing. Had the two men been captured, Hushai could have been exposed. Zadok and Abiathar could have been compromised. David might not have received the warning. A rebellion fought with armies was also being fought through whispered messages, hidden messengers, divided loyalties, and ordinary people willing to take risks. Jonathan and Ahimaaz reached David. They delivered the warning. David did not hesitate. He ordered everyone with him to move. They crossed the Jordan during the night. By morning, the biblical account says, not one of David's group remained on the western side of the river. That single night changed the strategic situation. Ahithophel had wanted to strike David before he recovered. Now David had distance. He had a river barrier. He had warning. And most importantly, he had time. The very thing Ahithophel had tried to deny him. Meanwhile, Ahithophel realized what had happened. His advice had been rejected. He understood the consequences more clearly than most. A man with his political insight could likely see that delay gave David exactly what David needed. The biblical account describes what followed with stark brevity. Ahithophel saddled his donkey. He returned to his hometown. He put his household affairs in order. Then he took his own life. He was buried in his father's tomb. The counselor who had helped make Absalom's rebellion so dangerous was gone. It is one of the darkest turns in the narrative. We are not given a long speech explaining his mind. We should not invent one. But his actions show that he believed the political situation had fundamentally changed. Absalom still had Jerusalem. He still had supporters. He was still gathering an army. But Ahithophel no longer appears to have believed the rebellion would end as Absalom hoped. David, meanwhile, traveled toward Mahanaim. The name carried old memories within Israel's story. Generations earlier, Jacob had passed through this region and encountered the messengers of God before crossing toward a dangerous reunion with Esau. Now another man from Israel's covenant history arrived there under threat. Mahanaim lay east of the Jordan and offered David a place from which to rebuild. And people began coming to him. That was the danger Hushai's delay had created for Absalom. David had escaped Jerusalem looking like a defeated man. But exile gave the kingdom time to reveal who would remain loyal. Sheba, son of Nahash, came from Rabbah of the Ammonites. Makir, son of Amiel, came from Lo-debar. Barzillai the Gileadite came from Rogelim. They brought supplies, beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honey, curds, sheep, cheese. The list may sound unusually detailed for a political crisis, but it communicates something important. David's followers were exhausted. They were hungry. They were in the wilderness. An army cannot exist on loyalty alone. People need food, water, rest, equipment, shelter. The rebellion was becoming a contest of logistics as much as emotion. Absalom had captured a capital.
David was rebuilding the network required to fight for a kingdom. Those bringing supplies were not performing glamorous acts. Yet without such support, David's soldiers could not remain in the field. The Bible's account of political survival includes both famous warriors and people carrying grain. Meanwhile, Absalom crossed the Jordan. The delay was over. The great army Hushai had encouraged him to gather was moving east. Absalom appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was related to David's family, another reminder that this civil war cut through kinship lines. Families were not simply choosing between Israel and a foreign enemy. They were choosing between David and David's son. Men who shared ancestry could now stand on opposite sides of the battlefield. David reorganized his own forces. Joab remained one of his principal commanders. Joab's brother, Abishai, commanded another division. Ittai the Gittite, whose loyalty had been tested during the flight from Jerusalem, commanded a third. David counted and arranged the people under commanders of hundreds and thousands. The humiliated procession that had left Jerusalem was becoming an army again. Then David announced that he himself would go out to battle. His followers immediately refused. They understood the central strategic truth better than anyone. David was worth more than thousands of ordinary soldiers to the rebellion. If half of David's army died, the struggle could continue. If David died, the political meaning of the war would change instantly. That was why Ahithophel had wanted only David. That was why Absalom's rebellion ultimately revolved around one man. David's troops insisted that he remain in the city. The king agreed. He would stay by the gate, where reinforcements could be organized if necessary. Then, as the commanders prepared to leave, David gave an order. Not privately, not in a whisper. The people heard him say it. His words concerned the man responsible for the entire war. Absalom, the rebel, the prince who had turned Israel against him, the son who had taken Jerusalem, the man whose movement had forced David into exile. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. There it was, the impossible tension at the center of David's heart. The king needed Absalom's rebellion defeated. The father wanted Absalom preserved. David was fighting to regain a kingdom without losing the son who had tried to take it. To his soldiers, the situation was more practical. Absalom was the enemy commander. As long as he lived and retained supporters, the rebellion could continue. But to David, Absalom was still the young man, still his son, still someone he wanted alive. This tension would soon place David and Joab on opposite sides of a decision that could not be undone. Joab heard the command. Abishai heard it. Ittai heard it. The soldiers heard it. Spare Absalom. Then David's forces marched out. The battle took place in the region described as the Forest of Ephraim. This was not the open ground on which Absalom's massive numbers might have offered their greatest advantage. The terrain itself would become part of the battle. Dense country, broken ground, woodland, places where formations could become confused, where men could be separated, where pursuit could become deadly. 2 Samuel would later make the striking observation that the forest consumed more people that day than the sword. The civil war had reached its battlefield. David's men met the forces of Israel. Thousands who belonged to the same covenant people were now prepared to kill one another over the throne of David. This is where Absalom's ambition had led. The man who once stood beside the gate, promising people better justice, had brought the nation into war. The man who kissed those who approached him now commanded forces against his own father. The prince, whose beauty had been praised across Israel, was about to discover that admiration could gather an army, but could not guarantee victory. And David could do nothing but wait. He remained behind while the soldiers disappeared toward the fighting. His kingdom, his commanders, his son, all of them were now somewhere beyond the gate. And among the thousands entering the forest,
Joab carried two things with him: a soldier's determination to end the rebellion, and a father's command that Absalom must live. Soon he would be forced to choose which one mattered more. The armies moved into the forest. On one side stood the forces loyal to David, organized under Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. On the other stood the army of Israel under Absalom. This was no longer a struggle fought through whispered accusations at a city gate. No longer a contest of image. No longer a conspiracy carried by secret messengers. The rebellion had reached the point where men from the same nation were now facing one another with weapons in their hands. The consequences of Absalom's ambition had become impossible to hide. Israel was fighting Israel. David remained behind at Mahanaim. His soldiers had insisted that he not enter the battle because the enemy valued his life more than thousands of others. That meant the king could not control what happened in the forest. He had given his command: deal gently with Absalom. Now he had to trust that the men leading his army would obey it. But the person carrying the greatest responsibility was Joab. Joab knew warfare. He had fought for David through years of conflict. He understood what rebellion could do to a kingdom. He knew that as long as Absalom remained alive, the possibility of another uprising remained. And yet, David's command had been unmistakable: spare the young man. The conflict between military necessity and a father's mercy was now moving toward its breaking point. Battle began. 2 Samuel tells us that David's forces defeated the army of Israel. The loss was enormous. 20,000 men fell that day. But the text adds a striking observation. The battle spread over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives than the sword. The exact dangers of the terrain are not described in detail, so we should not invent them. What the narrator wants us to understand is clear enough. This was chaotic ground. The landscape itself worked against a large army. Absalom had wanted an overwhelming force gathered from across Israel. Hushai had encouraged exactly that strategy. But numbers are only an advantage when those numbers can be used effectively. In broken country, dense terrain, and a scattered fight, the very size of an army can become difficult to control. The experienced soldiers of David were fighting on ground where discipline and familiarity with irregular warfare mattered. Many of these men had spent years with David before he ever sat securely on a throne. They had lived in wilderness strongholds. They had faced stronger enemies. They had learned to survive when conditions were uncertain. Absalom had gathered national enthusiasm. David had battle-hardened commanders. Now the difference was becoming visible. The rebellion began to collapse. Absalom's forces were pushed back. Men scattered. The movement that had seemed almost unstoppable when David abandoned Jerusalem was now losing thousands in the forest. But one person mattered more than all the others: Absalom himself. As long as the rebel prince escaped, the political struggle might not be over. He could retreat, regroup, call supporters back together, find another city, raise another force. Civil wars are rarely settled merely because one side loses a single field. They end when the political center of the rebellion can no longer continue. And Absalom was that center. At some point during the battle, Absalom encountered David's men. He was riding a mule. That detail is sometimes overlooked. Absalom is not described here on a war horse charging at the head of his men. He was moving through the forest on the animal when he passed beneath the branches of a great tree. Then came the moment that would become the most famous image of his life. His head became caught in the tree. The mule continued beneath him. Absalom was left suspended between heaven and earth. This scene has often been retold, as though the Bible explicitly says that Absalom's famous hair became tangled in the branches. But 2 Samuel does not state that. Earlier, the narrative did emphasize the extraordinary weight of his hair when it was cut.
That earlier detail has naturally influenced artistic imagination. Yet here the text says that his head was caught in the tree. We should remain with what Scripture actually tells us. Absalom was trapped. The man who had once moved through Jerusalem with a chariot and 50 runners now could not move at all. The prince, who had gathered Israel around himself, was separated from his army. The man who had almost taken David's throne was hanging helplessly in a forest. The irony is difficult to miss. Everything that had made Absalom appear powerful was now useless. Popularity could not free him. Royal ancestry could not free him. Beauty could not free him. The army he had gathered could not free him. His political speeches could not free him. His claim to kingship could not free him. The rebellion that had nearly taken Jerusalem from David had come down to one man unable to escape a tree. But Absalom was still alive, and David had commanded that he remain alive. One of David's soldiers saw him. The man did not kill him. Instead, he went to Joab. He reported that he had seen Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab's response was immediate. Why had the soldier not struck Absalom to the ground? Joab said he would have rewarded him with silver and a warrior's belt. But the soldier knew exactly why he had not acted. Everyone had heard David's command. The king had publicly instructed Joab, Abishai, and Ittai to protect Absalom. The soldier understood what killing the king's son could mean. Even if Joab offered a reward now, what would happen later when David learned who had ignored his command? The soldier essentially told Joab that no amount of silver would persuade him. Even if he had been offered an enormous reward, he would not have raised his hand against the king's son. And then he added another observation. Nothing could be hidden from the king. If he had killed Absalom against David's explicit order, Joab himself might have stood aside rather than protect him from the consequences. The soldier understood Joab. He understood court politics. He understood that a commander could encourage an action in the field and later distance himself from the man who carried it out. So he refused. This unknown soldier did what David had commanded. He saw the leader of the rebellion helpless before him. He had the opportunity to end the war personally, and he did not strike. His restraint makes what follows even more significant, because Joab had heard the same command. The soldier saw David's instruction as binding. Joab saw the rebellion through another lens. Joab had already spent years navigating the dangerous space between David's personal emotions and the demands of maintaining a kingdom. He had watched David's family conflicts grow. He had helped bring Absalom back from Geshur. He had been manipulated by Absalom when his barley field was burned. He had watched Absalom build his public image. He had seen the rebellion force David out of Jerusalem, and now thousands of Israelites lay dead. To Joab, preserving Absalom might look less like mercy and more like leaving the source of the war alive. The Bible does not record a speech explaining every thought that passed through Joab's mind. We should not pretend it does, but his decision becomes clear through action. Joab told the soldier that he would not waste more time arguing with him. Then he moved toward Absalom. The prince was still alive in the tree. The battle around him was already collapsing. David's men were winning. The rebellion could have ended with Absalom captured. He could have been brought before David. The king could have decided what happened next. That was still possible. But Joab was about to remove that possibility. Before we follow him to the tree, it is worth remembering how Absalom arrived there. Because the forest was only the final stage of a much longer collapse. Absalom's story had not begun as a military rebellion. It had begun in David's family. Tamar had been violated. Amnon had escaped immediate visible punishment. Absalom had allowed hatred to grow in silence. Then he killed Amnon. He fled. He returned. He forced Joab's attention by burning his field. He stood before David.
David kissed him. And then Absalom began constructing something new. Chariot, horses, 50 runners, a position beside the gate, conversations with dissatisfied Israelites, promises of better judgment, personal gestures, years of cultivation. He had learned that a kingdom could be attacked through perception before it was attacked by weapons. Then came Hebron, the secret messengers, the trumpet, Ahithophel, Jerusalem, David fleeing barefoot, Absalom entering his father's capital, the public acts that made reconciliation almost impossible, the rejection of Ahithophel's urgent plan, the decision to gather all Israel, the crossing of the Jordan, and now the forest. Every step had increased Absalom's power. Every step had also narrowed the path back. By the time he entered battle against David, there was no longer an easy distinction between the son and the rebel king. He had transformed a family wound into a national catastrophe. And he was not the only one paying for it. 20,000 men were dead. Think about what that number represents. Families across Israel would receive news that sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands had not returned. Some had fought for David. Others had fought for Absalom. They all belonged to Israel. This is the wider cost of ambition. Leaders may speak about crowns, legitimacy, justice, and destiny, but ordinary people often pay for those claims with their lives. The rebellion that began with Absalom stealing hearts was now consuming bodies, and the irony became even sharper. Absalom had once stood by the city gate, suggesting that he could bring justice to Israel. Now Israel was bleeding because of his attempt to seize authority. The man who had promised to solve disputes had created a civil war. That is one of the central reversals of his story. Absalom presented himself as the answer to the kingdom's problems. He became one of its greatest problems. But David's own failures cannot simply be removed from this picture. The biblical narrative does not allow us to place every cause on Absalom alone. David had failed within his family. The aftermath of his own sin had deeply affected the household. His response to Amnon had left devastating questions unresolved. His relationship with Absalom had moved through exile, partial restoration, and reconciliation, without preventing the son from becoming a rival. The rebellion belonged to Absalom, but the soil in which it grew had been cultivated by years of dysfunction in David's house. That is what makes this story more than a simple account of a wicked son attacking a righteous father. David was the legitimate king. Absalom was the rebel. Yet David was not a flawless victim, and Absalom was not born in a vacuum. Scripture is willing to hold both truths at once. Human stories are often complicated that way. Consequences overlap. One person's sin becomes the setting for another person's choice. Then the second person's choice creates new suffering for others. Responsibility does not disappear simply because there were earlier causes. Amnon was responsible for what he did to Tamar. David was responsible for his failures. Absalom was responsible for murdering Amnon and for launching the rebellion. Joab would be responsible for what he was about to do. The Bible does not need one villain to carry every failure. It allows each character to stand beneath the weight of his own decisions. Meanwhile, David knew none of what was happening around Absalom. He was waiting. Perhaps he could hear distant reports from messengers arriving from the battlefield. Perhaps the gate at Mahanaim remained filled with movement. But the text gives us no indication that David knew his son had become trapped. His final instruction still stood: spare Absalom. There is something heartbreaking about David's position. As king, he needed victory. As father, victory itself terrified him. If news arrived that his army had lost, he could lose the throne and perhaps his life. If news arrived that his army had won, he might lose his son.
For everyone else, the outcome could be reduced to politics. David or Absalom, old king or new king, loyalist or rebel. For David, the categories overlapped painfully. The enemy was his child. The rebel was someone whose face he remembered from before there was a rebellion. That is why his command had been so unusual. Deal gently with Absalom. No ordinary enemy commander would have received that protection. David was asking soldiers in the middle of a civil war to remember what he could not forget. Absalom was still his son. But Joab was approaching the tree. The soldier who had discovered Absalom had refused to kill him. Joab would not show the same restraint. The commander gathered weapons in his hand and moved toward the helpless prince. Around them, David's army was winning. Absalom's rebellion was breaking. And now the fate of David's son no longer depended on Absalom's army. It depended on the man who had once brought him home from exile. Joab had helped restore Absalom to Jerusalem. Now he stood beneath the tree where Absalom hung helpless. David had given one command. Joab had reached another conclusion. And in the next few moments, one of them would become irreversible. Joab stood beneath the tree. Above him hung the son of David. Absalom was still alive. The rebellion that had driven David from Jerusalem, divided Israel, and left thousands dead, had reached a moment no strategist could have planned. The prince, who had once moved through Jerusalem with chariots, horses, and 50 men running before him, was now helpless. The man who had spent years building an image of strength could not free himself. And the commander standing below him had already decided that David's command would not determine what happened next. Joab took 3 weapons in his hand. He thrust them into Absalom while he was still alive in the tree. Then 10 young men who carried Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck him until he died. David's son was dead. The rebel king was dead. The man who had almost taken Jerusalem without a battle would never sit on David's throne. And the person who ended his life was the same man who years earlier had engineered his return from exile. Joab had helped bring Absalom back. Now Joab made certain that he would never return again. The circle was complete. But there was no triumph in the way this story ends. Absalom's death solved a military problem while creating a devastating personal one. Joab immediately blew the trumpet. That sound had appeared before in Absalom's story. At Hebron, a trumpet had announced the beginning of his claim to kingship. Now another trumpet announced the end of his rebellion. Joab's signal stopped the pursuit. David's forces no longer needed to continue destroying the army of Israel. The political center of the revolt had fallen. Without Absalom, the reason for the battle had changed. The surviving Israelites fled toward their homes. The rebellion that had spread through the tribes began dissolving almost as quickly as it had risen. Absalom's body was taken down. Then his men placed him in a large pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over him. There was no royal funeral, no procession through Jerusalem, no coronation tomb, no final gathering of the people who had once kissed his hand and celebrated his claim. A heap of stones in the forest marked the end of the prince who wanted a kingdom. The text then gives us an intriguing contrast. Earlier in his life, Absalom had erected a monument for himself in the King's Valley. He apparently did so because he said he had no son to preserve the memory of his name. The biblical record elsewhere mentions sons of Absalom, creating a question scholars have discussed. It is possible those sons did not survive to preserve his name, or that the statements reflect different points in his life. The text does not explain the tension in detail. What matters for the story is the motive attached to the monument. Absalom wanted his name remembered. He set up a pillar and named it after himself. That is a revealing image beside the grave in the forest. A man can build a monument to preserve his name. He cannot control what that name will mean.
Absalom wanted remembrance. He received it, but not in the way he intended. His name would be remembered as the son who rose against David, the prince who stole Israel's hearts, the rebel who entered Jerusalem, the man whose ambition nearly destroyed his father's kingdom, and the son whose death broke David's heart. The battle was over, but David did not know that yet. He was still waiting at Mahanaim. The king sat between the two gates of the city. A watchman climbed to the roof above the gate and looked into the distance. Then he saw someone running alone. He called down to the king. David immediately interpreted the sight. If the runner was alone, perhaps he carried news. Then the watchman saw a second man running behind the first. Two messengers, two sets of footsteps moving toward the king. Joab had sent a Cushite with the report. But Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, also wanted to run. Ahimaaz had already served David during the intelligence operation out of Jerusalem. He had risked capture carrying messages. Now he wanted to deliver the news of victory. Joab initially resisted. This was not a day, he said, for Ahimaaz to carry the message. Why? Because although the army had won, the king's son was dead. Joab understood David well enough to know that the news could not simply be called good, for the army victory had come. For David, victory and disaster were arriving in the same report. Ahimaaz insisted. Finally, Joab allowed him to run. Ahimaaz took a route that enabled him to outrun the Cushite. From the city, the watchman saw the first runner drawing closer, then the second. David knew the running style of Ahimaaz. When the watchman identified him, David responded with hope. "He is a good man and comes with good news." That sentence captures David's expectation. He wanted to hear that the army was safe. He wanted to hear that the rebellion had failed. But there was one question above every other question. Ahimaaz arrived. He cried out that all was well. He bowed before David. He praised the Lord for delivering up those who had raised their hands against the king. The kingdom had been saved. David did not ask first how many enemies had died. He did not ask whether Jerusalem was secure. He did not ask whether Joab had survived. He did not ask what had happened to Amasa. He asked, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The entire war contracted into one question. "Is my son alive?" Ahimaaz hesitated. He said that he had seen great confusion when Joab sent the king's servant, but he did not know what had happened. Whether Ahimaaz truly did not know the details, or simply avoided delivering the painful message directly, the text does not explain. David told him to step aside. Ahimaaz stood nearby. Then the Cushite arrived. He announced good news for the king. The Lord had delivered David from those who rose against him. Again, David asked the question, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered carefully, "May the enemies of the king and all who rise against him for harm become like that young man." There was no need to say more. David understood. Absalom was dead. The king was deeply shaken. He went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. As he walked, he cried out words that have echoed through centuries of biblical memory. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom!" For David, the rebel title disappeared. He did not cry, "My enemy." He did not cry, "The traitor." He did not cry, "The man who stole my throne." He cried, "My son." Then came the most painful line. "Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." David wished he could have died in Absalom's place. Politically, that made no sense. If David had died and Absalom had lived, the rebellion might have succeeded. The kingdom could have remained in the hands of the son who had betrayed him. But grief is not strategy. The father was not calculating the future of Israel in that room. He was mourning a child he would never speak to again. And perhaps that grief carried memories beyond the battlefield. The text does not list what David remembered, so we should not invent thoughts and place them inside his mind as fact. But the audience knows the history that stood behind the cry. Absalom as the prince born into David's house. Tamar devastated. Amnon murdered. Absalom fleeing to Geshur. Years of separation. Joab arranging his return. 2 more years without seeing David. Absalom finally bowing before him. David kissing him. Then chariots. The gate. The conspiracy. Hebron, Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives. War. And now death. There would be no second reconciliation. No later conversation between father and son. No opportunity for David to ask why Absalom had gone so far. No possibility for Absalom to turn back. Every unresolved conflict between them had ended in the forest. That is part of what makes David's grief so powerful. Death does not merely end a life, it can close doors that people believed might remain open. The reconciliation David had once offered had not prevented rebellion. Now reconciliation was no longer possible at all. The army began returning. They had fought for David. They had risked their lives. Thousands of their opponents had fallen. They had defeated the rebellion. They had saved the king. Under normal circumstances, victorious soldiers would enter with celebration. But word spread through the troops. The king was grieving for Absalom. The result was extraordinary. The victory became mourning. 2 Samuel says the people stole back into the city quietly. Like soldiers ashamed after fleeing from battle, these men had not fled. They had won. Yet they entered as though they had been defeated. David covered his face. His cry could still be heard. "My son, Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" The king's grief was understandable, but the political consequences were becoming dangerous. The men returning from battle needed to know that their sacrifice mattered. They had obeyed David when he needed them most. They had followed commanders into a civil war. Some had watched friends die. They had confronted a larger national force while defending a king who had been driven from his own capital, and now their victory felt like a source of shame. Once again, the tension between David the father and David the king had become impossible to ignore. Joab entered the king's presence. The same Joab who had ignored David's command concerning Absalom was now about to confront David over his grief. Joab's words were severe. He accused David of humiliating the men who had saved his life. They had preserved the lives of David's sons, daughters, wives, and concubines. Yet David's behavior made it appear as though he loved those who hated him and hated those who loved him. Joab pressed the point with brutal clarity. If Absalom had lived and all David's loyal servants had died, Joab said, it seemed that David would have been pleased. The accusation was intentionally harsh. It was not a gentle pastoral conversation. Joab was speaking as a commander whose soldiers were watching the king. Then he issued a warning. David needed to get up. He needed to go out. He needed to speak encouragingly to his servants. If he remained hidden in grief, Joab warned, the army might abandon him that very night, and that disaster could become worse than every crisis David had faced since his youth. Joab had killed David's son. Now he was telling David how to mourn him. It is one of the most uncomfortable relationships in the entire story. Yet Joab understood something real. A king does not suffer alone. His public response affects the people who depend on him. David had the right to grieve as a father, but he also had responsibilities as king. The same office Absalom had tried to seize now demanded that David rise from grief and face the people who had restored it to him. So David got up. He took his seat in the gate. Word spread. The king was sitting there.
and the people came before him. The gate is an important image. Absalom had once positioned himself at a gate. There he intercepted Israelites who came seeking justice. There he cultivated loyalty. There he slowly stole the hearts of the people. Now David sat at a gate after surviving Absalom's rebellion. The image had reversed. The son who used the gate to undermine the king was dead. The king now sat publicly before those who had preserved his throne. But victory did not mean Israel was healed. Absalom was gone. His supporters remained. The tribes remained divided. Thousands were dead. Many people had openly supported a rival king. David could not simply walk back to Jerusalem and pretend nothing had happened. The rebellion had exposed fractures in the nation that needed to be addressed. Across Israel, people began arguing among themselves. David had once delivered them from enemies. He had rescued them from the Philistines. But he had fled the land because of Absalom. Now Absalom was dead, so why had no one yet brought David back? The question reveals the political uncertainty following the battle. Absalom's death did not automatically restore the old order. People had to decide where their loyalty now belonged. David also had to decide how to return. He sent messages to Zadok and Abiathar. They were to speak to the elders of Judah. Why should Judah be last to bring the king home? David was from Judah. His own tribe had deep connections to him. Yet tribal politics had become complicated. David needed to rebuild support, not merely assume it. Then he made a surprising move. He spoke concerning Amasa. Amasa had commanded Absalom's army. He had stood on the other side of the civil war. Yet David promised to make Amasa commander of the army in place of Joab. Politically, the move could help reconcile former supporters of Absalom. By elevating a rebel commander, David could communicate that the war was ending and that those who had followed Absalom were not all going to be destroyed. It also revealed David's growing conflict with Joab. Joab had once again acted against David's will. David had commanded Absalom to be spared. Joab had killed him. David could not easily forget that. Amasa's appointment was therefore both an act of reconciliation toward former rebels and a challenge to Joab's position. The text says David turned the heart of all the men of Judah as one man. A message went to the king. Return. David began moving toward the Jordan. The same river he had crossed while fleeing was now part of his journey home. But the return would not be simple. Old conflicts waited along the road. Shimei, the man who had cursed David and thrown stones at him, hurried to meet the returning king. Mephibosheth would come with a different account of what had happened when David fled. Barzillai, who had supported David in exile, would receive the king's gratitude. Judah and the other tribes would argue over who had the greater claim upon David. The rebellion was dead. The divisions that made the rebellion possible were not. And Absalom's shadow would remain over everything that followed. Because David had recovered the throne at a price no father would willingly pay. His kingdom was saved. His son was gone. That is the deepest tragedy of Absalom's story. He nearly achieved everything he wanted. He took Jerusalem. He gathered Israel. He forced David into exile. He sat where the king had sat. He came closer to David's throne than almost any enemy David ever faced. But ambition had carried him farther than wisdom. He had interpreted admiration as legitimacy, popularity as destiny, access to power as a right to possess it. And when he finally reached for the crown, the result was not glory. It was a forest filled with the dead, a father crying above a city gate, and a grave covered in stones. Absalom had wanted Israel to look at him and imagine a king. In the end, Scripture leaves us looking at something else.
A son who could win the hearts of a nation, but could not escape the consequences of the path he chose. And David, who had survived the rebellion, now faced one final challenge. He had to return to Jerusalem and rule the people who had been divided between him and the son he was still mourning. The battle was finished. The consequences were only beginning. Absalom was dead. The army that followed him had scattered. David's soldiers had won the battle. And yet, the kingdom David was returning to was not the same kingdom he had left. Military victory could remove a rebel leader. It could not erase the wounds that had produced the rebellion. It could not restore the thousands who had died. It could not undo Tamar's suffering. It could not bring Amnon back. It could not give David another conversation with Absalom. And it could not make Israel forget that for a time much of the nation had been willing to follow another king. The war was over. Rebuilding trust would be harder. David began the journey back toward Jerusalem. The road itself forced him to encounter people who represented different pieces of the crisis. Some had cursed him. Some had supported him. Some claimed they had been misunderstood. Some had remained loyal when loyalty looked dangerous. And now every encounter asked essentially the same question. What kind of king would David be after Absalom? The first major figure to confront him was Shimei. When David had fled Jerusalem, Shimei had followed him from the hillside at Bahurim, cursing him, throwing stones, and declaring that his downfall was deserved. At that moment, David had refused to let Abishai kill him. Now the situation had reversed. David was returning. Absalom was dead. David's army had won, and Shimei understood exactly how vulnerable he had become. So he hurried to meet the king at the Jordan. He was not alone. 1,000 men from Benjamin came with him. Ziba, the servant of Saul's house, also came with his sons and servants. Shimei fell before David. He confessed that he had sinned. He begged the king not to remember what he had done on the day David left Jerusalem. Abishai had not forgotten. Once again, he wanted Shimei executed. Why should the man who cursed the Lord's anointed be allowed to live? But David rejected the proposal. This was not a day for executions. David had recovered his kingship. He did not need to mark his return by killing everyone who had humiliated him in defeat. He swore that Shimei would not die that day. The moment reveals something important about restoration after civil conflict. A king can reclaim authority through force. He cannot rebuild a divided nation through force alone. David needed former opponents to believe there could be a future after rebellion. If every act of disloyalty resulted immediately in blood fear might produce obedience for a time, it would not necessarily produce unity. David's mercy did not erase the seriousness of Shimei's actions. It showed that the returning king understood that victory had to be followed by restraint. Then another man appeared, Mephibosheth. He was the son of Jonathan and grandson of Saul. Years earlier, David had shown him extraordinary kindness because of his covenant with Jonathan. Mephibosheth had been invited to eat at the king's table and had received property connected to Saul's household. But when David fled from Absalom, Ziba had met him with supplies and accused Mephibosheth of remaining in Jerusalem because he hoped Saul's dynasty might somehow be restored. David, under pressure, had accepted Ziba's account. Now Mephibosheth appeared before him. His physical condition suggested mourning and neglect. He had not cared for his feet trimmed, his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day David left until the day he returned safely. David asked why he had not gone with him. Mephibosheth gave a completely different account. He said Ziba had deceived him. Because Mephibosheth was unable to walk normally, he depended upon assistance to travel. He claimed that he had instructed Ziba to prepare a donkey so that he could accompany the king, but Ziba abandoned him and then slandered him before David. The biblical account does not pause to give us an independent investigation that resolves every detail. David divided the property between Ziba and Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth responded that Ziba could even take it all, because what mattered most to him was that David had returned safely. The episode is small compared with the civil war, yet it fits the larger story. Absalom's rebellion had created a world in which loyalty was difficult to judge. Information had been weaponized. People had acted quickly. David himself had made decisions while fleeing under enormous pressure. Now returning to power, he had to sort through consequences created in the chaos. Civil conflict rarely leaves neat categories behind. Not everyone who appears loyal is loyal. Not everyone accused of betrayal is guilty, and even a wise ruler can make judgments with incomplete information. Then came Barzillai. His appearance offered a very different contrast. Barzillai was an elderly and wealthy man from Gilead. When David reached Mahanaim as a fugitive, Barzillai had helped provide for him. He had supported David when there was no guarantee David would ever return to Jerusalem. Now he came to accompany the king across the Jordan. David wanted to reward him. He invited Barzillai to come to Jerusalem, where the royal household would provide for him. But Barzillai was about 80 years old. He explained that he no longer desired the life of the royal court. He wanted to return home and eventually be buried near the graves of his family. Instead, he proposed that Chimham go with David. David agreed to care for him. Then David kissed Barzillai and blessed him. The old man returned home. Barzillai's loyalty had not been purchased with promises. He had helped David when David seemed weak. That made his faithfulness particularly meaningful. Absalom had spent years persuading people that loyalty should move away from David. Men like Barzillai showed that not every heart could be stolen. But the greatest political problem remained. Judah and the other tribes of Israel were beginning to argue. The kingdom had survived the rebellion. The unity of the kingdom had not been fully restored. The men of Israel asked why the men of Judah had taken the initiative in bringing David across the Jordan. Judah responded that David belonged especially to them because he was their close relative. The men of Israel answered that they had 10 shares in the king and therefore had even more claim upon David. The exchange became increasingly heated. The text says the words of Judah were harsher than the words of Israel. This dispute may seem minor compared with Absalom's rebellion. It was not. It revealed that the fractures beneath the monarchy remained. Absalom had not invented every division in Israel. He had exploited divisions that already existed. Tribal identity remained powerful. Questions of representation remained sensitive. People cared deeply about who had access to the king and whose loyalty mattered most. Absalom's years at the city gate had worked precisely because dissatisfaction already existed. He did not need to create every grievance. He only needed to position himself as the man who understood them. Now David had returned, but the same fault lines were visible. And almost immediately another rebel emerged. A Benjaminite named Sheba, son of Bichri, sounded a trumpet and declared that Israel had no share in David and no inheritance in the son of Jesse. The language was explosive. Many Israelites withdrew from David and followed Sheba. The men of Judah remained with the king. Absalom was dead, but rebellion had not disappeared from the kingdom. This proves something essential about the story. Killing Absalom solved the immediate crisis. It did not solve every condition that had made rebellion possible. David now had to confront yet another revolt, and the man he chose to lead the response was Amasa. This was remarkable. Amasa had commanded Absalom's army. David had promised to replace Joab with him. The appointment was likely intended, at least in part, to help reconcile those who had followed Absalom. Amasa was given orders to gather the men of Judah within 3 days, but he delayed beyond the appointed time. David became concerned that Sheba might become even more dangerous than Absalom if allowed to reach fortified cities. So David sent Abishai and the royal forces in pursuit. Joab went with them, and the rivalry between Joab and Amasa soon ended in blood. When the two men met near the great stone at Gibeon, Joab approached Amasa as though greeting him peacefully. He took hold of Amasa's beard as if to kiss him. Amasa did not notice the weapon in Joab's other hand. Joab struck him. Amasa died. Once again, Joab eliminated a man who stood between him and what he believed the kingdom required. First Absalom, now Amasa. David might be king, but controlling Joab had always been one of the most complicated problems of his reign. Eventually, Sheba was pursued to Abel-Beth-Maachah. Joab's forces began attacking the city. A wise woman called out and negotiated with him. When she learned that Joab wanted Sheba rather than the destruction of the entire city, she persuaded the people to kill the rebel and throw his head over the wall. Joab blew the trumpet. The forces dispersed. The rebellion ended. Then Joab returned to Jerusalem. Even after David tried to replace him, Joab once again stood at the head of the army. The political consequences of Absalom's revolt continued to reshape relationships around the king. But what of Absalom himself? What did his life ultimately mean? The easiest version of his story would portray him as a handsome, arrogant prince who wanted a throne and received the punishment he deserved. But Scripture gives us a more complicated story. Absalom was beautiful, that is explicitly stated. He was ambitious. His later actions make that impossible to deny. He betrayed David. He openly declared himself king against his father. He helped plunge Israel into civil war. Those truths must remain clear. But before all of that, there was Tamar. Before Absalom stole Israel's hearts, his own family had been wounded. Before he murdered Amnon, Amnon had committed a terrible crime. Before Absalom became an exile, David's household had already entered a cycle of sin and consequence. Absalom's anger did not begin from nothing. But legitimate anger eventually became illegitimate vengeance. Vengeance became alienation. Alienation became ambition. Ambition became manipulation. Manipulation became rebellion. And rebellion became war. At several points, Absalom could have turned in another direction. That is why the earlier wrongs against his family do not erase his responsibility. He chose to murder Amnon. He chose to cultivate political loyalty against David. He chose to deceive his father about the trip to Hebron. He chose to declare himself king. He chose to continue the rebellion after taking Jerusalem. And thousands eventually suffered because of those choices. Pain can become a crossroads. Absalom turned his pain into power. But power did not heal him. It enlarged the damage. His famous beauty is therefore one of the great ironies of the story. The biblical writer goes out of the way to tell us how impressive Absalom appeared. Israel praised his appearance. His hair was remarkable. His public presence was carefully constructed. He possessed the visual qualities people could associate with greatness. But the story refuses to allow appearance to become the measure of kingship. Israel had already learned this lesson in the days of Saul. When Samuel was later sent to anoint one of Jesse's sons, God warned him not to judge by outward appearance or height. Human beings look at what is visible. God sees differently. David himself had once been the unexpected choice. Now one of David's sons looked every bit like a prince and gathered people around the image of what he might become. But biblical kingship required more than charisma, more than attraction, more than popularity,
more than the ability to identify public grievances. It required faithfulness. Absalom could gather hearts. He could not govern his own ambition. He could expose weaknesses in David's administration. He could not provide a righteous alternative while pursuing power through deception and rebellion. He could promise justice at the gate, but the road he chose ended with Israel killing Israel in the forest of Ephraim. This is perhaps the darkest irony of all. Absalom first appears at the center of the story because justice failed Tamar. Later he presents himself to Israel as the man who would give everyone justice. If only I were judge, that was his appeal. But the man who complained about failures of justice eventually tried to seize the kingdom through conspiracy. His proposed cure became another disease. This does not mean his criticism of David's system had no basis. A manipulator does not always use imaginary problems. Often the most effective political manipulation begins with real frustrations. Absalom seems to have understood this. He met people with actual disputes. He affirmed their complaints. He made himself personally accessible. Then he redirected their dissatisfaction toward loyalty to himself. There's a difference between serving people and using their grievances to build personal power. Absalom crossed that line. His relationship with David is equally tragic. David loved his son. That is undeniable by the end. When David heard that Absalom had died, his grief overwhelmed the celebration of victory. He wished he could have died in Absalom's place. But love alone did not produce a healthy relationship. David's story shows that affection without wise action can fail. The king became angry after what happened to Tamar, but the narrative does not show an effective resolution. He eventually allowed Absalom back from Geshur, but refused to see him for 2 years. Then he kissed him and restored access without any recorded process capable of preventing what came next. Again, Scripture does not tell us every private conversation. We should not claim more than the text gives us. But within the story as narrated, unresolved relationships repeatedly become dangerous. The exile was not enough. The return was not enough. The kiss was not enough. The family needed something deeper than proximity. By the time David understood how far Absalom had gone, his son had already spent years winning the nation. There is also a larger connection to David's own earlier failure. Nathan had warned that the sword would not depart from David's house. The chapters that follow show violence multiplying within the family. Amnon violates Tamar. Absalom kills Amnon. Absalom rises against David. Civil war follows. Joab kills Absalom. The pattern is not presented merely as random tragedy. David had received forgiveness after his sin involving Bathsheba and Uriah. But forgiveness did not mean the destruction created by his actions vanished from history. Scripture can hold mercy and consequence together. David remained the Lord's chosen king. His covenant significance remained. Yet his choices wounded his household. This is one reason the Bible's portrayal of David is so powerful. It does not need to make him perfect in order to make him important. And it does not need to deny his faith in order to tell the truth about his failures. The same is true in reverse for Absalom. We do not need to deny the genuine wrong done to Tamar in order to recognize that Absalom became a rebel. Biblical storytelling often refuses the simple categories we prefer. One person can be wronged and later become a wrongdoer. A father can love his son and still fail him. A king can be chosen by God and still make destructive decisions. A popular movement can identify real problems and still offer a disastrous solution. Absalom's story contains all of these tensions, and there is one final image worth remembering: the monument. Absalom had erected a pillar so that his name would not disappear. He wanted to leave something behind. Almost every ambitious ruler does. A building, a dynasty, a victory, a title, a memory. Absalom nearly had the greatest monument possible, a kingdom. For a brief moment he controlled Jerusalem. For a brief moment David was the fugitive, and Absalom looked like the king. But power that seems permanent in one chapter can disappear in the next. Hebron shouted his name. Jerusalem received him. Israel gathered around him. Then the forest swallowed the rebellion. Absalom's monument remained. Absalom did not. The throne returned to David, yet even David's return was not the ultimate end of the biblical story. David's dynasty would continue. Solomon would eventually sit on the throne. The kingdom would reach extraordinary wealth and influence. Then it too would fracture. Israel and Judah would divide. Kings would rise, kings would fail. Jerusalem itself would eventually fall. The Bible gradually makes clear that no merely human ruler can carry the full weight of the hope attached to David's line. David was great, but flawed. His sons were flawed. His dynasty would need something greater than another ambitious prince. The later biblical story would continue to look toward a faithful king from David's line, whose kingdom would not be established through manipulation, family rivalry, or civil war. We should make that connection carefully. Absalom himself is not presented as a direct prophecy, but his failure belongs to the larger biblical problem of human kingship. Who can rule faithfully? Who can administer justice without using justice as a path to self-exaltation? Who can possess authority without being possessed by ambition? Those questions continue far beyond Absalom. For the immediate story, however, the conclusion remains painfully human. A father regained his kingdom and lost his son. A rebellion was defeated, and thousands of families mourned. A prince who wanted to be remembered became unforgettable, but his memory became a warning rather than a coronation. Beauty had given him visibility. Ambition had given him momentum. Betrayal had given him Jerusalem. None of them could give him a secure kingdom, because Absalom's greatest enemy was not simply David's army. It was the path he had chosen long before the final battle. The path from silence to vengeance. From vengeance to estrangement. From estrangement to self-promotion. From self-promotion to conspiracy. From conspiracy to rebellion. From rebellion to war. And from war to a tree in the forest. That is why the complete story of Absalom cannot begin with his attempt to seize the throne. By the time Absalom declared himself king, the tragedy was already years old. The rebellion began long before the trumpet sounded in Hebron. It began when wounds inside David's house were allowed to deepen, when justice failed, when hatred was nursed, when relationships remained unresolved, when personal grievance became personal ambition, and when a prince discovered that winning hearts could become a road to power. Absalom almost took David's kingdom. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though he had. But the kingdom survived. The family never fully recovered. If this documentary helped you see Absalom as more than the man caught in a tree, tell us in the comments which biblical character should receive the complete story treatment next. And if you want to continue following the rise, failure, and legacy of David's house, the next story should not begin with another foreign enemy. It should begin inside the royal family once again, with the struggle over who would inherit David's throne and the rise of Solomon. Because Absalom's rebellion ended in the forest. But the battle for David's succession was not over. Absalom almost stole David's kingdom, but long before he reached for the throne, the battle had already begun inside David's house. The complete story of Solomon, wisdom, power, and a divided legacy. Understand how David's son built Israel's greatest kingdom